Stareable Fest 2021 is a 4-day celebration of innovation in independent streaming series. We're a creator convention, bringing you the most relevant production workshops, panel discussions, giveaways, and an industry marketplace connecting the next wave of indie series to execs at AMC Networks, Blumhouse, Disney TV Animation, and more. We're a festival, screening your new faves, from rich fantasy to absurdist comedy, hosting an award ceremony, and several parties to kick it with your fellow fans and creators alike.
If you call it if you call
Hello, and welcome to today's conversation, extending your content to other communities. Stareable Fest is the premier annual indie TV and web series festival in the US and the new home for digital creative talent in the TV industry. They honor the year's best content and provide a space for the next generations of creators to connect with industry executives, grow their network, learn new skills, and build community. Stareable Fest this year is presented by Dell Technologies, with NVIDIA making workstation and monitor solutions purpose-built for creators like you. We'd also like to thank the other sponsors and partners, AMC Networks, Disney TV Animation, Rizzle, and Just for Laughs, for making Stareable Fest 2021 possible. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Bri Castellini, and I will be your moderator for today's event. I am the former Stareable Community Director and all-time lover of Stareable Fest. I am the current Seed and Spark Film Community Manager. It's the filmmaking crowdfunding platform, if you're not aware. I am an adjunct professor for digital media and web series, so spot on branding. And I'm also a writer director myself of web series and short films alike. And I co-host the filmmaking podcast Breaking Out of Breaking In, which I co-host with Christina Rea, herself also an independent filmmaker based in New York City, just like Stareable, and crowdfunding expert. So that's plenty for me. I would now love to invite all of my panelists to come up on stage with me. I'm going to let them introduce themselves because I think that's always the most effective way to get to know somebody. So looks like we're being joined. Hello. How's it going?
It's going really well. How are you?
I am doing good. I love talking to people and sharing things with them. And I like that this circumstance makes it feel like we're all kind of together, which is something that I've really been missing. What about you guys?
Yeah.
Oh, all right, cool. Well, thank you so much for all being here today. I guess I'll go in the order that you came up on screen so that I could hear a little bit about you. So if you guys could introduce your names, your current position, maybe most recent project, just so the audience can get an idea of who you are and why you're so exciting to be here with us today. I guess I'll start with Arij.
Hi, everyone. My name is Arij. I am the managing director of culture change at an organization called Pillars Fund, where we work to amplify the leadership, talents, and narratives of Muslims in the United States and the UK. So my job is really that I have the incredible privilege of working on maximizing the way that Hollywood represents Muslims, which is a catch-all for so many other groups, which I can talk about a little bit later in the conversation today. I would say probably my most recent project is I'm currently consulting on season 3 of the Golden Globe winning show Rami, and I'm super excited for you all to see season 3.
Awesome, that's so exciting. All right, Brant, what about you?
Hey everybody, I'm Brant Rotnam. I am the creator of Hidden Canyons, which is the first fully produced series on TikTok. It's a queer soap opera that uses 1-minute micro episodes to shed light on issues within the LGBTQ plus community, particularly underserved narratives. So we are currently wrapping up our second season, which is going to be coming out on TikTok later this fall.
Very exciting stuff. Yeah, we'll definitely come back to all of this.
Yeah.
So Stacy, you next.
Yes, hi, I'm Stacy Parshall Jensen, and I am a writer, novelist, and screenwriter. My current project that I'm working on is a TV project that's in development with Jump Cut Incubator, and it is called Red Hand Warriors, and it's a story about this covert group of Indigenous women who work outside the law to find missing and murdered Indigenous girls and women, and they will also enact justice when the legal system fails. So it's set here in Minneapolis where I am right now. My other gig is I am a sensitivity reader. I do diversity editing and cultural consulting for just about any kind of written work, but also for podcasts and plays and movies. I work with publishing firms and TV shows, and it's a big market right now because everybody is, I think, like recognizing that this kind of work is really necessary. So I'm staying busy, but it's all good, and I'm really happy to be here.
Well, we are also happy for you. And Alex.
Hi, I'm Alex Kreswick. I am a recovering VP of Development and Production. I am a sensitivity reader and diversity editor, almost exclusively in the film, television kind of media space, because I marry a pretty high degree of business acumen. I'm a producer by training, with this kind of like generalized how these issues tend to present in film and television, because you are constrained a little bit by the medium itself. And I like to nerd out about stories. Currently, over the pandemic, I produced a short film written and directed by J.S. Mayank, starring Catherine Castro and Bridget Regan. So that was an accomplishment, figuring out how to shoot that COVID safe.
Yeah, I bet that was. So yeah, again, definitely coming back to all of that. So obviously today we are all here to talk about like extending your content into other communities, broadening inclusivity and diversity in the film and TV world. So I'm curious for all of you, because you all have very similar paths, but also very different current positions. And I wonder how you describe the work that you do in those spaces to someone who might be unfamiliar with the film industry in general. Like they might not even be thinking about how the sausage gets made, let alone how it is, made consciously and inclusively. So maybe in the same order, I'm just curious, how would you describe it to me if I had no idea what you were talking about, Arij?
Order, huh, Bri? You're gonna put me on the spot.
Thanks, Arij.
I'm a thinker.
My pleasure, y'all. Yeah, the way that I would describe my job is that, I believe that that representation should serve as both a mirror and a window to people. A mirror in the sense that they should be able to see themselves on screen, and a window in the sense that they should be able to see beyond themselves and build empathy with folks who are unlike them on screen. My job is to make sure that anyone who, one of the 1.9 billion people on Earth that identify as Muslim can find themselves on screen, which is not currently the reality that we live in, and that folks who don't belong to Muslim communities or don't know a Muslim personally are able to understand who a Muslim might be, what the many types of ways that one can be Muslim and look Muslim and act Muslim. In order to build empathy and ultimately really advance justice for all people. And that is how I would describe it is, I work to make sure those portrayals are really authentic, regardless of genre or topic, etc.
Awesome, thank you. Brant?
Yeah, I guess I would say if you have no idea what I do, I wouldn't blame you. Narrative content on social media is a very kind of new space, and there isn't much of a template for it or how to do it. So we're kind of experimenting within the space ourselves and trying to figure out what connects with people. My work, I write and create specifically for the LGBTQ plus community and allies. And I hope to use my voice in the industry to improve visibility and also to create space for others around me that have been historically underrepresented in the industry and media. The series that I work on focuses on current issues such as mental health within queer and trans communities, the relevance of coming out in today's world, family planning and parenthood within the community, and trans girls in sports.
Amazing. Stacey, what about you?
Well, what I usually tell people about being a sensitivity reader or diversity editor is that, first of all, everybody has biases. We all do. And anybody who tells us that they don't is just like really kidding themselves, because they're all there, And there's a lot of biases that are hidden or unconscious. And we are also usually driven by stereotypes because that's how things have been done. This is what we thought. This is what we've been shown. So my job is to help a writer identify what those hidden and unconscious biases are, and if there's any stereotypes that need to be addressed. So I spend a lot of my time reading and then preparing these detailed reports for the writers or for the publishers or agents or something that include the passages from the actual written work with an explanation and then a suggested fix. I believe as a sensitivity reader to not make any changes on the manuscript itself. And actually, there's only been a couple times that I've actually straight out said, you cannot do this, because everything else is like, well, I respect the story process. I respect every writer's creativity. And this is a huge pool for learning right now, so instead of having someone come in and just slash everything and omit and delete and then change it, I like to take the time so people can come to understand why that particular way of describing that character is disrespectful. And here are many other ways that you can do it that is only going to heighten your storytelling, make your characters more, three-dimensional. So, and then make them authentic, because that's really what we're all striving for. I believe that's what we're all striving for when it comes to storytelling. So that is really the way that I describe the work that I do. And I'm also really lucky that people who come to me, because I don't search out people necessarily and say, oh, it looks like you need me. People who come to me are in a place of like, okay, I'm not quite sure what I'm doing, but I feel like I need to get, another read or, get some sensitivity eyes on this. And so then they're open to, let's see how we can continue to tell stories in the best way possible.
Sure. Yeah. And Alex, what about you?
Yeah, so my pitch usually starts something along the lines of, I'll let you know why the internet's about to get really mad at you and how to avoid that. And it will be with memes, so it kind of doubles as a warning. But my sort of ethos going into this is I want your authorial intent to match the impacts of everything that you're putting on screen. I want it to be intentional. I want it to be curated. I want it to all be part of your story and your characters. Because the second that you kind of lean into stereotype, what you're actually doing is letting someone else dictate the terms of your story and the world that you live in. So my goal, especially like knowing how I move through the world, where I have like actual life experiences, where I know that I'm kind of synthesizing other people's works. When I do my reports, it's very important to me to make sure that I'm including and carefully curating the voices that I'm putting in front of you, that I am directing you not only to my voice, but also to like, you need to look at this person. My focus is always, who is the most vulnerable person in your storytelling? And how can we make sure that the stories that we're telling are servicing them and, putting them correctly within your world.
Right. No, that's really lovely. You're all so quotable. I love that. Alex, do you want to introduce us to your scene stealer?
Yes. This is my helper and everything. This is George Michael. She's named after a character from Arrested Development.
I love that.
Her sister Lindsay Ember is somewhere around here, but she pets when I'm online with other people, and pretty much only then. So,
well, she needs everyone to know that she's the scene stealer of it all.
Yeah, she's very pretty.
Listen, everyone, it's been a long pandemic. I want to meet your pets. So something that I think is a frustrating thing for me navigating spaces in media and film is that there's this misconception I see from kind of all sides that to be sensitive and to be inclusive to the characters in your stories who may not identify as you do, that the only way to be sensitive is to only have positive representation. The characters have to be model minorities or model majorities, depending on who's telling the story. And obviously that's not true. Complex storytelling requires conflict. So I'm curious how all four of you, and I'll Arij, will put you on the spot again. Anyone who wants to answer this is welcome to. How do you navigate being respectful in the way that you describe characters, like Stacey was mentioning, while also still, prioritizing storytelling and allowing characters to be messy and complicated?
I personally really like to challenge the notion of, when you say model, what do you mean, and whose version of model? Because part of like the first kind of step in the process is realizing that sometimes our point of view is like very specifically focused towards one viewpoint purposefully, so that you don't even consider that you're being kind of like shunted in this direction. And a good sensitivity reader comes in and starts like presenting other ways for you to access your own story. And that's what I really love doing the most, is kind of being like, okay, so you have this thing. What if you just like just a little bit over here, and we're looking at it this way instead of straight on the way we normally do? And I can actually usually watch writers like start to go like, oh, I have so much stuff that I can now play with within the context of my own sandbox. And I love that. Like, I really want you to succeed fundamentally. And I think that comes through in how you talk to people. And it's going to be different for all of us, because we all have like different strengths. And that's the coolest thing. Like, I love being on these panels to hear everyone else's ways of approach, because I'm always like, oh, this is so fascinating.
It's cool to bring colleagues together. But yeah, how else are you guys addressing the sort of tricky balance sometimes between being respectful, but also acknowledging that characters shouldn't be perfect because they need to grow? That's what stories are.
Yeah, Pillars is not really interested in uplifting what, someone might call like a model or a positive portrayal of Muslims. What we are interested in is two things. One is Muslims shown in all of their three-dimensionality, so that if you are seeing that messiness, you're also seeing where the neatness is. And two, to really like uplift dignified portrayals. And I think there's a very, very different connotation when we say positive portrayal or dignified portrayal. A dignified portrayal sees somebody as a whole entire person with a whole entire life, and really allows you to get to know that person. Now, what a lot of people might not realize is that, Pillars recently did a research study with USC Annenberg's Inclusion Initiative, and we partnered with Riz Ahmed and the Ford Foundation to do this. And what we found is that in nearly 9,000 of the characters that we studied through the 200 top grossing films in 2017 to 2019, only 1.6% of those characters were Muslim at all. Now, if you go deeper into that, and by the way, 24% of the world is Muslim, so I don't know.
There's a disparity here.
Yeah, and if you go deeper into that, into what those characters showed, you see that women were outnumbered by those Muslim men 175-1 on screen. You find that only one of those characters was LGBT. That person was a cisgender Muslim man that was gay. Only one Muslim was identified as having a disability, also a man. We found that this one is maybe shocking to some people, and maybe not shocking to other people who are more familiar with this, but over 30% of the primary and secondary characters we studied that were Muslim were perpetrators of violence, and another 54% were victims of violence, which means that we're primarily now seeing Muslims through a lens of violence. What does that do to a community? What does that do to the everyday lived reality of Muslims in this country? When you see a Muslim and you automatically think that person's going to hurt me, or that is a person to hurt. And what we want to do is uplift dignified portrayals. It doesn't mean that they have to be perfect characters. I think Gadalmi is a great example of this. If any of you have seen Gadalmi, I work on the show, and he is one of the most infuriating characters on TV. But what that show allows us to do is he's not the only Muslim that you're seeing. You get to see the full dimensionality of people who are more practicing, less practicing, complete F-ups and less complete F-ups. And that is really what brings the full humanity to light. And so I think that piece, what I would say is, at the end of the day, what we want to do is provide folks who have intimate knowledge of a community, the knowledge that you can't learn from a book, the knowledge that you can only learn from being part of a community, to actually be in those spaces and say, like, don't create anything about us without us. As James Charlton, the great disability justice advocate, would say, nothing about us without us. And that's really the place we want to get to.
Right. Right.
Wonderful.
I agree so much with what you just said about creating dignified. I often talk about agency. That can we see the characters and first of all, this is actually like writing 101. It's just like the goal you should have would be to create these three-dimensional, fully defined, authentic, genuine characters. But what we see that happens, as you just said, about when it comes to characters of color, and women, that we end up having these just little, like, one dimensional, if that. I usually do read for Indigenous themes and characters. I'm Mandan and Hidatsa from the MHA Nation in North Dakota, and then I'm part Black. And so those are the two races that I usually read the most for. And the same thing, where, the characters are either, victims, most of them are victims, and they're portrayed as ignorant and as violent. And it, I go, okay, honestly, I go from a place of like, okay, when I'm first reading something to, okay, this is really like triggering, to be honest, because there's something that happens there. And it's like, okay, I should be angry and uncomfortable about it. It's righteous, and now here's an opportunity, like I said earlier, to help somebody understand where that comes from. And so a lot of my work is to say, well, let's look at him from a different angle. Let's look at, can you answer these questions about this character? And oftentimes writers will not really even know why the character has to be, a person of color. Like there's a thing that's in their head about, like, well, I just, put this stamp on them and make them Cherokee because that's really the only nation, Indigenous nation in the country. So you make everybody Cherokee, then it's fine. I take the time, to do some of the research and present it to them of like, okay, so you set your story in this part of the country, regionally, and these are the Indigenous characters there. These are the Indigenous cultures. Let's really go in and help define this. So the story is just fuller. And usually what happens through doing that process is that they begin to develop three-dimensional. They begin to pull away from how they initially saw them, and they begin to create that agency, or as the word you use, dignified. They begin to become more dignified. And for some people, it's a long process, and I understand that, because we carry these things with us since we're really little, so it's like, well, it took a while for you to learn this poorly. It's going to take a while to learn it the other way too. So, the goal though is dignified, definitely.
I love that.
There also
I
aren't
love that.
necessarily. Sorry.
Okay. Please.
I was just going to say there aren't necessarily a lot of other places to have these conversations as well,
Oh.
especially in relation to work. So sometimes we're the only people who people are accessing these conversations through.
Yeah.
Yep.
No,
Yeah.
it's totally true.
I love that that mention of agency and dignified agency, Stacey. I think with queer characters in media, we're often sidelined. We're often the best. We're killed a lot of the time. There's a look up Bury Your Gays if you don't know about it. Or if we're not killed, we're the best friends who doesn't get to have a true narrative arc of their own, often to serve the interests of usually a female lead. And I think that one thing that helps boost the complexity and depth of characters is just centering us within the narrative. If you make diverse and queer characters and trans characters the leads of your stories, you're not going to write boring stories about them, because that's going to make a bad film or TV project. So I think just realigning the center towards groups that haven't been historically seen as leads does a lot to make inroads in this problem.
Definitely.
I totally agree. I do think, though, that brings us kind of to a new element that'll also bring me to our first audience question about, like, who is in charge, not just who on screen is centered, but who is in charge. So we have a question about advice for writing a script with an ethnically diverse cast. I assume the question asker does not identify as many diversities, at least ethnically, based on the tenor of this question. So I am curious how you approach that same strategy, all these same strategies, when you're speaking to somebody who wants to have a diverse group, but maybe not for the right reasons quite yet. They have great intentions, but the execution might, not be there yet. So I'm curious, how would you answer that question if it came to you through this event?
Yeah. I mean, if it's right, if I jump in first,
Yeah,
I think
start
that, so I write for my own community, which is the LGBTQ plus community. And by the same token, that community is a huge umbrella of which I represent only a tiny fraction. And, as I got deeper into helping, finding the identity of the series, it felt like if I were only to write my own experience, it would be a series about cis white men, which is maybe not what is needed right now. So if I'm going to write about characters that aren't me because that's what needed, what's the right way to do that? And I think, I can't answer it for everybody, but for me, the solution was to bring in other creative talent very early on in the process. So I have not just consultants, but I have essentially my two co-creators on the series now, Fazia Mirza and Nava Mao, came on very early in the process to not just give up head nod yay or nay to the storylines, but to write storylines themselves and to direct their own storylines. And I think if we want to be a series that represents the broadness of the LGBTQ plus experience, it's inappropriate for the behind the camera and the creative team not to fully represent that breadth as well.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I totally agree, because I think if we look now at some of the TV shows and the films and stuff that are really like showing up to support what they're saying about inclusivity, you can see the difference in the storytelling. You can see the lens that is different, and the stories are just better. And I mean, of course, the first thing that comes to mind is a current Reservation Dogs, which is incredible. And Sterling, who I've had the pleasure of meeting, he's super funny and really, really generous, and an incredible artist. And for him to make a point of saying, this is what the writers' room needs to look like. So bringing somebody on right away makes sense, because oftentimes, if you're doing the work at the end, which sometimes is the case for me, I'll get something that is like, oh, this has to go to publisher right away, or we are actually casting this show next week, so can you take a look at these sides? It's kind of like, well, there's only so much I can do with that, whereas we were having the conversation in the very beginning at the inception of it, then it would have been totally different. So the effort that we see people making by pulling in diverse voices and having more inclusivity in the writers' room, above the line, we see how that is really paying off. The stories are just richer for that. And so that would be the first thing I would say to somebody about, like, well, you want this diverse cast of characters? Well, let's get those people. Let's talk to those people. Let's do that research and get those voices with you in the very beginning. So that's what I'd say.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And just because I don't think I can add anything of value in the knowledge and skills part of this. I would say, like, there's some pretty important mindsets that I would recommend for a creator. I totally agree, Stacey, with what you said about bringing, and actually both of you and Brant as well, about bringing folks in early. I'm sure every consultant could tell you they have a story. I literally just had this happen with a major production house who asked me to consult on a story that had a Muslim character that they were filming 3 days like after they were sending it to me. And it was such a mess. But what I will say about that is, like, there were some major things I could have fixed, but I think the issue there, and this is the mindset piece, is that we can often as creators be so precious about our vision and our thing that we can be unwilling to accept the feedback of people who actually have intimate knowledge. So if you were really excited about this hat that someone from Iran would definitely not wear, and someone is telling you that, like, we have to like let go of that preciousness, because I promise you it will ultimately make your work better and stand the test of time in a way that it will not otherwise. And folks they want to both protect you and their own communities by allowing your story to be more real, more authentic. And so I guess in addition to the skills and mindsets of bringing people in, or the skills and knowledge of bringing people in and to get to the right place, also that mindset of just like, let go. It's okay. Nothing is precious. I promise you your work will end up better for it.
Yeah, a different character can wear that hat.
You know what I find along with that though is that the whole, along with like holding their babies precious, you know, and the whole kill your babies is like, well, then that's what you got to do. You got, you know, and I always tell them, it's like, well, you obviously created all of that first, you know, so you put it aside, you're not going to lose that. There could be something else in there that's going to show up, or something that you need from that for a future story, for a future character, you know, so that's one thing. I think what happens, what also happens is that people are holding some of this so much as a part of them that they can't how do I say this? They can't back up from the page. They can't back up from the story. And so it becomes this huge affront to them where it's like, wow, you're saying I'm racist. And then as soon as they say that and they become defensive, well, you know, first of all, if someone's defensive and someone else is talking at you, nothing gets through. It just will not, you know? So then at that point, they have to deal with where all of that is coming from and what that means. And it can become a much longer journey for them to even get back to their original story. So I think a lot of times writers and artists and stuff are afraid of that, you know, and they're afraid of that vulnerability that they have to feel to kind of, you know, go through this minefield that they already know is out there. I mean, because they're talking to you. They came to me. So they already know that something's not quite landing and stuff. So so that's why, like I said initially, what I was trying to talk to everybody about is that we all have biases. And then when I tell them that it's hidden and unconscious, you know, that kind of opens it up to like, oh, okay, you get this. This is, you understand that this kind of anxiousness that I'm feeling. Now, of course, if there are stories that are like blatant, well, then that's totally different. You know,
Right.
It's just like, you know, if it's really painful and over the top, then it's like, no, that's not hidden. Not at all. You know what you're doing, and that's how we're going to address this. But generally, and, you know, helping people understand that the vulnerability is also really entrenched in us. Hopefully that helps people like open up and, you know, do the work that needs to be done.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it's fair to say the advice for writing a script with an ethnically diverse cast is to involve people early on. I think that, you know, all indie filmmakers get a little precious about their work because usually it's just them when they're starting out and they don't really find other people until they get to the casting and crewing part. And that's fair. Sometimes you don't know anyone until you've finished something. So I also think something I've seen people do, especially in the web series community where the casts tend to be a little bit larger than say for a short, is involve your cast. If you want to include people of various races and sexuality, then why not talk to the people who will be portraying them? You know, you can't just take their word for it, but, you know, include them and let them take a little ownership. I think we are all a little afraid to give up the ownership because it's our show, but it can still be your show and under your purview and still be open to other ideas and experiences to make your show better.
Thank you for saying that, Bri. I wanted to mention something about that too, which, you know, for my series, we have a cast of 12, and I think that actors don't get enough credit a lot of the time. I think actors are really smart people, and the first season of our series was a little bit more, here are the scripts, let's work on them. The second season was a little more deliberate about, okay, this is what happened with your character in season 1. This is where we're thinking it might go in season 2, but how do you feel about that? And, you know, do you feel that your character is represented well? Do you feel that this is dynamic enough and that there's enough to play with that you'd be really excited about this? And it sparked some really intense conversations that went on far longer than was really comfortable. It was sort of like, we're 5 days from shooting and we're still having conversations about what these scripts are. And then ultimately, once it was all done and we could all kind of breathe out, I saw how much better it ended up being. for all of those conversations. It took longer, but ultimately, I think it really paid dividends in the final product. So I would wholeheartedly recommend that to anybody out there, to have those conversations with your actors.
Yeah, totally. Putting in the work is always going to be worth it. You know, you get out what you put in. So put in as much of yourself and the people that you respect as possible, and you're going to come out with something that you respect to have been made. So we have another question, more sort of logistical for all of you when you're going through either your own script or others. What is your process for going through a script? What do you look for first? What is do you have taglines that you're looking for, or are you just sort of letting the story wash over you and then reflecting after? I'm very curious.
Well, my process is I do 2 full reads of anything that I'm looking at, at least 2 full reads. And so the first read, I just read to get the story. And if anything pops up, then I just highlight it, and just leave it so I can keep going. Because sometimes I'll see something that'll pop up and that calls for my attention, and then a little bit later on I see something that adds to it or addresses it or something. It's like, oh, okay, so then this is a way that we're going to be able to talk about this particular thing, so I go through the first time and do that, and then in the second read I go slower, and then I pick out those passages or the words or the character development or whatever it is, and that's what gets cut and pasted onto a different report. And then that's where I start working on what the explanation is, why that popped out, and the possible suggested fix. And then I go through, if there's stuff that is like in larger documents, like I'm thinking about some games that I've been working on. I've been hired to do some with some gaming companies that are doing adaptations of previous games, as they've said, were written by a bunch of white guys in the 80s, and so they definitely need help for this. So these are massive documents. So I will end up going through maybe even 3 or even 4 times to begin to really pull all of that together, so it gets clearer about this is also the character's development. Being able to speak to all the elements of storytelling is really important. So I can go through and write that too. So that's generally my process as I work.
Very organic process, taking it all in context. I love that.
I usually start out with a conversation with my clients. Specifically, I want to know what your story is about. And I don't mean that in a tell me the beats of your story. I mean, tell me what the story is what are you trying to tell me as a reader? What is the experience you want me to walk away from? Because that will tell me a lot, not only about authorial intent, but in having that conversation, I can generally get a pretty good grasp on not only the strengths of the sort of point of view that we're coming from, but also I get a pretty good sense of what I'm looking for within the script. And then I go through it with the understanding, because when I do headline notes, like the kind that you would get from a development exec within the industry, so I'm marrying, here's the problem, here's also a suggested fix or a way to think about the fix in a very similar way. But I always start with a conversation first if I can, to really gauge what we're going for, to help me guide my notes, because I want them to be in line with what the writer and the intent, and if there's a production team behind it, the producers, the director, whoever has an opinion, I want to give you the best sort of guide to where you're trying to go.
That's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, cosign, I think both of those, starting with a conversation, and also similarly when I'm doing sensitivity reading, I have a rubric that I look through that helps me remember all of the different intersecting systems of oppression I need to be on the look for, because even sensitivity trainers have inherent biases towards what they notice more, what they don't. So setting ourselves up for success is really important. I would say specifically within my area of dominant expertise, which is Muslim representation, we do actually have a really exciting guide that is free for anyone to use on our website called The Blueprint for Muslim Inclusion. It includes many suggestions for folks that are from production companies, agencies, film festivals, et cetera, on how they can improve Muslim representation. But it also has some pretty great guides and resources on where to source the types of questions that you can be asking yourself as a the bar is on the floor, but those bars on the floor questions that you can just start before you actually come to a consultant like myself or someone on the Pillars team who would be able to give you that more nuanced piece. So an example of this would be the RIS test. The RIS test is a test that our dear friends in the UK developed that is very similar to the Bechdel test, if folks are familiar with the Bechdel test. And the questions that we ask ourselves is, if the film or show stars at least one character who is identifiably Muslim, is the character, one, talking about the victim of or the perpetrator of terrorism? In the majority of cases, they are. Two, are they presented as irrationally angry? Three, are they presented as superstitious, culturally backwards, or anti-modern? Our research found that over 50% of Muslims that showed up on screen were showed in settings that took place in the distant past, showing that like we're extinct, right? Like we're not with it these days. Four, are they presented as a threat to a Western way of life? And five, if the character is male, are they presented as misogynistic? Or if they, are female, are they presented as oppressed by their male counterparts? If the answer to any of those is yes, then your film or TV show or script fails the test. So I think that's a really good place to just for beginners to start because it's what we see most commonly. And after that, we can get into all the really exciting nuances of like, let's connect you with a trans Ethiopian Muslim that, has a lot to say about the specific character. But that's really the place where I think folks can start.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, definitely. Brant, what about you for like your own scripts? And as you're going through them yourself, as you're going through them with your co-writers, where do you start? What's the process?
I think that we start with meetings and discussions about where the world is right now and what we want to say. And then, we make a big list of kind of what hasn't been talked about, who haven't we seen on screen, what hasn't been represented, what nuances within the community have we not seen identified in other media. And then we go to the characters that we have already and we sort of say, who can we get in a room together and how can we naturally talk about some of these issues in a way that fits within the existing narratives that we have going for these people. So it isn't about two random characters getting into a room and dealing with an issue that we want to deal with, that it fits within the realm of reality and it's baked into the fabric of what's happening in their lives. And then we go through many revisions and we do apply various things along the lines of Arij, what you're talking about in terms of how our characters represented and Bechdel test. And I'm thinking of one particular instance this last season where another one of my writers and co-creators said, hey, by the way, you have these two women in a room and they are helping deal with this guy's problem for too long. And I hadn't seen it. And so I think it's really good to kind of sit and force yourself to have those uncomfortable conversations and make sure you're looking at things from all different angles. So that's kind of how we get there. It's very slow, but I would again, really recommend taking the time to have all of the painful conversations because I think ultimately you end up with a better script and a better story.
Yeah, being open is often the first step. And I also think that it's worth mentioning. So like Hidden Canyons is on TikTok and it's a lot of micro episodes, but you can do a lot more in the web series space that I think that more people should be taking advantage of. Not only are you like literally distributing in a much more intimate way to your audiences than ever before, and that allows you to get a little more granular with conversations, but you also can make a lot more with a lot less if you're creative and open and willing to have those conversations. So web series can be a really lovely way of exploring all of the different shades of things that you want to say without having to wait for a gatekeeper to say it's okay. So just shout out to web series is all I'm saying.
Yeah, love it.
Sure. So we are at Stareable Fest after all. So now I want to talk about sort of obviously the five of us understand why what we do is important and what is important to us personally, what is important to us professionally as creators, as consultants. But I do think there is still a resistance from a lot of people who are gatekeepers in our industry in terms of like the point. So not to bring the Chappelle Netflix special up, But I think it's a useful framework for how a lot of people who are still very much in charge think about the way that, hashtag representation matters. The co-CEO recently stated that he doesn't understand why people say that this is inciting violence, because we've seen people's, guts blown off in so many movies recently, and that doesn't create violence. Nobody's mad at that. And I think that obviously that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what violence means in context. So I'm curious, what is your answer to people who say, well, it's just TV, it's just a joke? How do we justify the fact that media matters more than just for entertainment quality? I'm curious.
I just ask them if they think that any artist has ever made a piece of art without an opinion, point of view, or intent behind it. Even your most ridiculous, write-off, fun piece of media has a mind behind it that has opinions, has thoughts, wants to take you on a journey. And if the journey that they curate for you is not the same journey that is curated for other people, that's a problem, especially depending on what you're talking about, because certain conversations should not just be for like the dominant group.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Well, I could talk about this literally all day. This is like my passion, but I will try to keep it as concise as possible. People don't wake up one day and just decide to hate trans people or decide to hate Muslims or decide to hate Black people. And I actually think it's actually not even true that the media isn't causing an uptick in violence. I actually just fundamentally disagree with that premise even. Because if we think about, for example, the violence of against marginalized groups on TV, and then say that that's not connected to things like bathroom bills that are suddenly being debated again, or it's not connected to things like Muslim bans that were literally like the law of the land just a bit ago. That it's not connected to things like the incredible fight between those who want to defund the police and reimagine public safety and those who want to uplift the work of our police forces, who, for those that don't know, were invented when they were slave catchers. For people who were enslaved. It's all very, very connected. And to say that isn't violence, we see violence on TV all the time that actually creates a narrative ocean that we're all swimming in. And we can't even tell that it's water because we're just fish in this ocean. It's just all around us, and it's creating not just hatred in folks that don't identify with necessarily like many marginalized groups, but also like the self-imposed like internalized oppression that we are all socialized into is also a major problem. And being able to step out of that that's a form of violence as well. So I think, I really could talk about this all day, but to sum it up, I think like no one wakes up one day and just decides to hate a group. We're socialized into that. And media is one of the most dominant forms of that socialization that we have.
Yeah, I agree. 100%.
Yeah. I mean, I remember the 90s very well. And I think that, Dave Chappelle kind of represents this old guard of comedians that felt like you had to offend to be funny, and you offended everybody equally. And it was Louis C.K. and Family Guy and all this stuff, and nobody was safe from any of it, and it was all okay because we're doing it to everybody all the time. And I think that your point about gatekeepers, Bri, I think that those gatekeepers are the old guard too. And I think that we have had a great new generation of comedians that come up and like, you can without being a jerk to everybody around you. And with Dave Chappelle specifically, I don't think that he equally offends everybody. I think he's had a long-standing history of attacking the LGBTQ plus community, and for some reason, particularly trans women. And I think that it particularly in this time now when the rights and safety of trans women is threatened more than to specifically target that group and to say it's okay and it's just jokes and it's not going to have repercussions is I think it's naive and inexcusable. So
yeah,
I think it's a good example of the internalized identity of, wait, what do you mean something I wrote means that I'm transphobic? No, and the inability to rectify that difference. But sorry, Arij.
No, sorry. Again, I thought I could talk about this forever, but I think the other thing that is really frustrating about that situation specifically is that when we get into this idea of playing Fashion Olympics with one another as marginalized groups, we fail, and by we I mean Dave Chappelle. We fail to recognize that by doing that, he is essentially erasing people who are Black and trans.
Yeah.
To say that trans people don't have it as hard as Black people. Well, I personally know multiple people who are Black and trans. And so what then? What does that mean? And so I think bringing in, that's why I think, I call out that research where I can share that, there were no trans Muslim characters on TV and there were no disabled Muslim characters on TV and et cetera. Because when we have this lack of imagination about what one person can contain, which is just endless multitudes, we truly fail to be able to imagine and create the type of society that can contain those things in a way that is safe and allows us to thrive. And so that's why that kind of super surface level oppression Olympics just does not do it for me, because it's erasing so many people that currently exist right now.
Right.
And to kind of build on that point and to tie in what Brant said, the conversations that you have, the people who are included and the people who are not, are equally loud conversations, but we are not supposed to notice one of those groups. Dave Chappelle actually flips what that script normally is, where you're just not supposed to recognize certain groups even exist within a world. What Dave Chappelle's doing, what people are doing for Dave Chappelle, is ignoring the people that he's not talking about and saying, looking at the people he doesn't, going, oh, well, he's mocking everybody. It's like, no. It's very specific who he's mocking, and it's very specific who he's not. And those two things in all ways, that's oppression, that's violence. Erasure is a form of violence. It is a form of media. It's replicating forms of genocide in our media. It's not great.
Yeah, no, it's not great. And it refuses to imagine the world complexly. And when you don't see any versions of yourself or only see violent versions of yourselves, however you want to define that, then you internalize that. And I think everyone probably has an example, even the most privileged among us, of how seeing something on screen changes the way you think about the world around you, about yourself, So even just on an anecdotal level, I think we all know that they're just being defensive for defensive's sake and for capitalism's sake. And I think it's childish that this is still happening and that they're refusing to acknowledge very basic truths that if you got them in a room alone, we all know they'd acknowledge. So I want to just shout out that we have about 5 minutes left. So anyone in the audience, if you have other questions for our panelists, I'm happy to include you. But we do have another question. Question for Brant. How are you?
I know.
Brant, how are you able to use minute-long restrictions of TikTok to tell a complete story in your series?
Oh, it's fascinating.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for that question. It's not it's not easy, but it's also I think that there's sometimes freedom in constriction, right? It's sort of like setting limits on poetry. If you have a certain space of time to tell a story, you have to tell it in that space of time. And we've never really run into issues of having extra fat or things that weren't really relevant. So we have to kind of cut down to the heart of what each arc is. They also end up being very talky, which is why we have decided that it's a soap opera. They have these kind of wild twists every minute. And if you actually watch them all stacked next to each other, it's just ridiculous because, in an 8-minute conversation, things don't generally twist as wildly. But I will say that I don't, we're still figuring out as we go. I think that we're not the ones to have invented minute narrative. I think other people have done it far better than we have too. We're just trying to explore this space. And I think one thing that is really unique about TikTok is that you get a ton of dialogue with viewers. People will write hundreds or thousands of comments under our episodes. And we really listen to that because it helps us hear from people what they like about the series, what we're doing well, what we're not doing well, what we haven't represented enough or in the right way. So yeah, it's all kind of a big experimentation.
That's cool.
Yeah, I love that. I think that it's a good microcosm of you don't make work in a vacuum, and that could be broadly applied
Yeah.
to this conversation as well.
Yeah,
And that's why something that a lot of you have brought up is, intent is not enough. The impact has to matter. I think Alex, you specifically brought that up, and that matters on a storytelling level as well as a representation level. You don't just get to exist in your own bubble world. Your narrative fits into a puzzle of all the other narratives that came before you. And if you're not being respectful and conscious about what that means, then of course people are going to get upset, and you have to own that. At the end of the day, we are only responsible for the stories that we tell. So be responsible in those stories. So just, I guess, last looks, any final words of wisdom and ways that people can follow the amazing work that all four of you are doing? We'll go in introduction order. Arij, final thoughts, and how can we follow all the great work you're doing?
Thanks. Well, I am at Arij Mikati, just my name on all of the things. So you can find me there. Pillars Fund is where I work. That's where you can look at all of our research and great work that we put out. Would be happy to have you follow us on all the things at Pillars Fund. And what was the other part of the question?
Any final words of wisdom? Parting words.
Words of wisdom. You're welcome, everyone else on the panel. I guess my words of wisdom are just to remember that intersectionality is really important, and that the more intersectional you get in your characters and the types of issues that you're naming, the more intentional you have to be about pulling in the different groups to make sure that by trying to support one group, you're not actually harming another. And that can be a real challenge, but it's such a joyful challenge because that means that we get to coalition build. And I'm super excited to continue that coalition building with my colleagues here that are on the panel and also beyond in this culture change space.
Love that. Brant, final words, and where can we find you in Hidden Canyons?
Yeah, I would say collaboration is my final word. I think that collaboration is so hard. The more cooks you have in a kitchen, the trickier a project can get. But I don't think you will ever regret bringing in more voices and more perspectives. Your storylines and characters will only be richer for it. You may tear your hair out in the process because it's just harder to create that way, but I think it always makes it better. So I would fully encourage it. And you can find Hidden Canyons on TikTok. It's at Hidden Canyon Series. It's also on Instagram as 1 Minute Gay Soap with the number 1. And we have a Eden Spark coming up that Bri has been helping us out, actually.
So random connection.
Fundraising for So we'll be fundraising for the most recent season, which is will be coming out next month.
That's very cool.
And thank you guys. This has been an amazing panel. I just want to say I'm humbled and honored to be here with the rest of these panelists. You guys are amazing.
Me too.
Stacey.
Yeah, so first of all, yes, this has been incredible. I love these conversations, and I also feel very honored to be asked to come and share my rambles. I appreciate that. I think the best way to find me is I have a website for the as a writer, and then also for the sensitivity reading and the other services that I provide, and that is just stacyparshalljensen.com. And then there's links on there to, other social media. And in addition to what has already been said about final words and words of wisdom, the first two things that popped in my head when you said that is about these stickies that I have on my computer in my office. And so just imagine, I have stickies all the way across the bottom, but the ones that stand out the most is this one that says, "Be curious," which I think is really great because it means you're stepping into a space where you're like, okay, I'm just going to see what this is. And if you can stay in that mindset, then you're always open to learning. So that's really important. The other one is actually a quote from Prince's song, Computer Blues. And it says, "Somebody please tell me what the hell is going on." So that is also a good question, I think. Well, at least that's a question I ask all the time. So those are the two things I have for words of wisdom. So.
Love that. And Alex, bring us home.
I am at Aleekza on most media, ALEEKZA, and you can reach out through my website, alexkreswick.com. And my words of advice are don't forget to laugh I think it cannot be understated how important it is to show us those positive stories, show us what we could be instead of the dystopia, which is really just things that are happening now, happening to everybody. It is so much harder to build. And remember, when you're stepping into other communities, you need to laugh with them. You need to understand like the in-jokes. When you can do that, you've got a pretty good foundation to build on, to ask your questions in a way that will inherently be respectful or come from a place of that genuine curiosity that Stacey is talking about. But like, laughter is contextual, and if you can laugh with somebody and you can understand why they find things funny, you have a really good place to build from.
That's great.
I love that. These are wonderful final words of wisdom. Thank you all so much for sharing your time, your expertise, your humanity with all of us. And thank you to everyone in the audience for participating with your questions and just being a part of this impressive community of creators. So once again, Stareable Fest is presented by Dell Technologies with NVIDIA, making workstation and monitor solutions purpose-built for creators like all of you. And we'll see you next time later today for another event with me, Bri Castellini, your new best friend. It is from 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern time. It's an event called the Ask Me Anything AMA with Jay Francis, who is the current VP of Original Series and Diversity at Disney TV Animation, brought to you by Disney TV Animation. So if you want to have an animated chat later on today, we hope you'll stop by. Thanks again for joining us, and have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thanks, y'all. Gratitude.
Thank you,
you.
Bri. Thank you, guys.
Bye now.